Hi everyone. I want to welcome you to our event. My name is Ashley Bird and I am the General Manager of the Monarch Butterfly and Pollinator Festival. Welcome to our kickoff event. We're so excited and fortunate that our first event is with Doug Tallamy and Nature's Best Hope. If you have not had a chance to read this book, I highly recommend it. It's available at the Twig bookstore here in San Antonio for signed copies, or you can order online. So as you know, we have a month-long festival. You can see all of our festival events at texasbutterflyranch.com. We would love to see you again. And we will also be having a Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there is a little box that says Q&A, and that's where you can ask your questions. We prefer that you wait until the end of the presentation, just in case Doug answers your questions. That way we don't have any repetition, but you're welcome to go ahead and put anything in there as soon as you're ready. And that's about it. We're gonna go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce our founder and director, Monica Mackley. She is a huge inspiration to me and to, I know, many of us, as she is so passionate and knowledgeable about so many pollinators, not just the monarch butterfly. So thank you, Monica. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to you.
Great. Hello, everybody. And thank you for joining us for our 5th annual Monarch Butterfly and Pollinator Festival. I'm Monica Mackley, founder and director of the festival and the Texas Butterfly Ranch, where our mission is to raise awareness and understanding of wildlife pollinators and the insects that sustain them and us. I really want to thank each and every one of you for coming out tonight. I know it's a busy time. We have a fantastic presentation with Doug Tallamy, which we have lined up for you. But first, let me just take a moment to recognize our sponsors. You may have noticed that all our presentations this year are online and free to the public. That's only been made possible by the generous support of our ecosystem sponsors: HEB, Valero Energy Corporation, the John and Florence Newman Foundation, the Winkler Family Foundation, and the San Antonio River Authority. If you appreciate our programming and find yourself crossing paths with these companies and organizations, I really encourage you to let them know how much you appreciate their support of our community, because this stuff wouldn't happen without them. In addition, tonight's event with Doug Tallamy has been underwritten in part by our friends at SAWS, San Antonio's award-winning water utility. Those outside the Alamo City may not know about the amazing work our local water utility has been doing for decades to encourage water conservation and native landscaping. Their most recent efforts include initiatives to encourage the conversion of turf grass to native plants. And their website, Garden Style SA, provides myriad resources to help you get on board. Garden Style SA hosts a trove of useful information: garden design and planting resources, how-to videos on everything from rainwater harvesting to pruning, and an in-depth guide to the top 100 locally appropriate drought-tolerant plants for San Antonio. I encourage each of you to check this out. And even if you're not in San Antonio, there's a lot of good stuff there. And if you're in a dry climate, the plant list is amazing. Also supporting tonight's webinar is our award-winning San Antonio River Authority, known affectionately in these parts as SARA. SARA's undertaken a massive riparian restoration in our city along the beloved San Antonio River, and that's resulted in 13 miles of interlocking parks and pathways. These are community resources that have been increasingly utilized in recent months as we've all been struggling with the pandemic's cabin fever. In 2017, the International River Foundation recognized SARA's efforts with the prestigious Theiss International River Prize, the world's foremost award in river basin management. Those of us who live in San Antonio are mighty proud of these two public entities. All right, let's get on with the show. You ready, Doug?
Sure.
Okay, well, hang on. Doug Tallamy is a professor at the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he's authored more than 100 research articles and 3 books, including 2 bestsellers. For more than 4 decades, he's taught insect taxonomy, behavioral ecology, humans and nature, and other courses. His primary research goal is to better understand insect-plant interactions and how such interactions determine diversity in animal communities. His first bestseller, Bringing Nature Home, published in 2007, was considered the it book in certain gardening circles and won Doug several awards while pretty much introducing the concept of native plants to gardeners around the world. His most recent bestseller, Nature's Best Hope, proposes crowdsourcing conservation to landowners and gardeners, or as one reviewer put it, a new approach to conservation that starts with you. Doug, thank you so much for joining us and kicking off our 2020 Monarch Butterfly and Pollinator Festival. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Monica.
Yeah.
A pleasure to be here tonight. I want to talk to you about my idea of what Nature's Best Hope is. But before I do that, I want to share with you something that happened last fall, not this fall, but last year, right about this time. All the red oaks, at least in the east, I don't think it got to Texas, but in the east, the red oaks got together and they decided they would all make their acorns at the same time. That's called an oak mast. This is what it looked like in many places. Well, I don't know if you're as easily entertained as I am, but I took one of those acorns and just stared at it. And lo and behold, an insect started to chew its way out of that acorn. That's what I was hoping would happen. And it chewed and it chewed. It didn't take long, maybe 15 minutes, squeezed its way out there, looked like a Pillsbury Doughboy, finally flopped on the ground. Well, this is a very dangerous time for this insect larva because it is really good to eat and lots of things want to eat it. So it's got to get below ground as fast as possible. So it wiggles and squirms, and in about 30 seconds down it goes, where it stretches in all different directions and forms a little underground chamber. Now within that chamber, it converts itself to a pupa and it stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, it comes out as an acorn weevil. This is what an acorn weevil looks like, very long. Looks like they have a long nose, but it's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. And they take the females, chew a hole with those mouth parts way down into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and that's how the larva gets down there. You might wonder why they spend 2 years underground, because red oak acorns take 18 months to complete their development. If they all came out the following year, there'd be very few acorns around for them. So they're very patient. Well, that of course leaves a hole in the acorn, and you all know that nature abhors a vacuum. That is a true vacuum. Well, there are specialized ants in the genus Temnothorax, 3 species that love to live inside the holes made by acorn weevils after they leave the acorn. So if they discover a brand new hole in a brand new acorn, they get very excited because they're going to move their colony from the old acorn, which at this point is falling apart. Everybody gets together, they carry the larvae back and forth. Again, only takes about 30 minutes, and they have gotten the entire colony into the new home. They post a guard at the door so no uninvited guests come in, and that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. Well, about this time, my wife asks, what's your point? What are you trying to tell us? My point is very simple. This is one of literally millions of specialized interactions that comprise nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays of all species and oaks around the world. Jays are the primary dispersers of acorns. They can fly up to 2 miles from the parent tree and disperse those acorns farther than any other of the acorn dispersers. Another specialized interaction, if you want pileated woodpeckers breeding in your yard, you can't have that without carpenter ants, because that's what they feed their young. And you're not going to have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Facilia. That is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And as a matter of fact, we've got about 4,000 species of native bees, and almost a third of them are very specialized in what they can rear their young on. For example, there are only about 13 species of, or there are 13 species of bees that can only rear their young on perennial sunflowers, just as an example. You're not going to have Baltimore checker spots unless you have white turtlehead. I could go on all night long talking about specialized relationships. But today, these types of relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And I'm glad he said that because that started the creation of the Grand Canyon National Park. The problem, of course, is that that's no longer an option over most of the country. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological state. So leaving it as it was is, again, not an option. And that's, of course, because we've logged the country repeatedly, we've tilled it, we've drained it, we grazed it. You know about grazing. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in the US. We've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers. We have introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents. Many of them are running amok in our natural areas as invasive species. In short, we have carved up the natural world into tiny remnants of its former self, each of which is too small and too isolated from other remnants to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that support us. You might wonder why we've done that. Well, we're not very good about thinking ahead. We had this idea that the Earth, our nest, was so large we could foul it forever and there'd be no consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And now we're seeing headlines that remind us that pretty regularly. 2 years ago, the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? They're talking about global insect declines. Followed by this headline, North America has lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of the North American bird population gone. As a matter of fact, the UN now predicts that we're going to lose to extinction, so that's a permanent loss, 1 million species, possibly in the next 20 years. And it's funny how they report this as if it's just another headline. I mean, that's almost equivalent to say, we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years. This is not an option, folks. It is not an option. We've got to get serious about conservation for our own good. Well, I could go on about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses, but it's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that's going to take small efforts from lots of people, but they will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return to this headline briefly. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, Edward O. Wilson, E.O. Wilson, famous entomologist from Harvard, told us what it would mean if we were to lose our insects. And he did it in a paper in 1987, entitled "The Little Things That Run the World." His message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, lots of nasty things would happen, starting with the loss of flowering plants. Most of our flowering plants would disappear, which would drastically end energy flow through terrestrial habitats. That energy flow that's the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds and mammals, so they would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that right now rapidly turn over nutrients. All we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself. As a matter of fact, I suggest we do that, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, let me remind you that humans are a product of nature. We are totally dependent on it. We're dependent on what we call ecosystem services, the products of healthy ecosystems. This is what some of the things that plants do for us. They produce oxygen, obvious, we need that. They clean our water. They slow it down. It's always going to be moving towards the sea where it's too salty to use, but plants retard it and hold it on the land surface much longer. Very important ecosystem service today is capturing carbon. They're pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, locking it up in their tissues in the form of carbon, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground from their roots. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited in them. Soil scientists now tell us that the Earth's soils could sequester 7 times the amount of carbon that is currently in the atmosphere right now, that would be very good. Well, who's going to do this? Plants that are going to do that. We got to put the plants back. Plants build topsoil, they hold it in place. If we didn't have any plants, the earth would just be a rocky surface because all the topsoil would be in the ocean. They prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, just some of the things that plants do for us. What do animals do for plants? Well, they provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants, disperse plant seeds, and of course, many other things. So developing landscapes or designing landscapes that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not an option. It never was a good option. It's a terrible option today. We've got, where are we now? 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet. We need more ecosystem services produced today than ever before, not fewer, and this isn't going to do it. Well, there were visionaries through the ages who recognized that we humans didn't have a very healthy relationship with the earth that supports us. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. Now, some of the indigenous people did manage to live on land without spoiling it. But Aldo said, you know, the rest of us, the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. And we're not very good at it. Particularly our Western extractive capitalistic society, just take more than the earth has to give and then move someplace else and do it again. There is no place else to move. So Aldo had a dream that we would develop what he called a land ethic. And he wrote about this in the Sand County Almanac. He knew that we had to use the earth. We had to farm it, lumber it, graze, mine, hunt, do all of those things. But his dream was that we would learn to do those things more gently. We would do them without destroying local ecosystems. And that's what he called the land ethic. What he never wrote about, I don't know if he thought about it, but he never wrote about developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was. First of all, there were a lot fewer people back then, but I think that the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist at the same time, same place, was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo's day, and it's still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have even recognized it as an option. But I'm going to argue tonight that living with nature not only is an option, I'm going to argue it is the only viable option that's left to us. You know, in the past, conservationists worked almost exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. But today we have to flip that on its head. We have to save nature. We've got to restore it where there are a lot of people, because that's most of the earth at this point. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Where are we going to do that? Well, we can't ignore private property. And that's because most of the country is privately owned. I think the figure in Texas is well over 90% privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If you add up even all the BLM land in the West, it's still around 75% privately owned. If we ignored private property, we would fail, because that means we would only be dealing with areas that are too small and too isolated from each other to sustain the species we need. Not only private property, but there's a lot of areas that we never think of as conservation options. How about power and pipeline rights of ways? There's 21 million acres of power and pipeline rights of ways, 3 more million acres of railroad rights of ways, 17 million acres of roadsides. You know, we got 4 million miles of paved roads in the US, and each of them has 2 sides. That's 17 million acres right there. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Airports, 3 million acres. You know, the Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are large areas. Then, of course, we have all the places where we live, both in rural areas, suburbia, our urban centers, hundreds of millions of acres in those places, all of which could be far more productive in terms of conservation than we're using them right now. So just adding up that's 599 million acres. And you can think of other places to make that figure even bigger. How big is 599 million acres? Well, it's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, plus Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, California. Yes, throw Texas in there too. Add up all these places, still less than 599 million acres. So not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We've got plenty of places we can do conservation. You know, I use the word conservation, but I'm using it incorrectly. We've already taken nature away from these places. We have to put it back. Restoration is not the right term either, because that implies you're going to restore exactly what was there before we wrecked it. and we're not going to be able to do that. But we can rebuild functional relationships, those specialized relationships within our ecosystems, to the point where they support a lot of species and still make deliver a lot of ecosystem services. They won't be exactly like they were before humans came along, but they still will be functioning ecosystems. Point is that there are some species that are much more important in that rebuilding process than other species, and other species depend on those building blocks. So we have to start with the most important species. And one of the things we have to do first is rebuild food webs. In other words, we have to allow the energy that plants capture from the sun and turn into food to move away from plants so that other animals can exist. Most animals do not eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants. And most of that something is caterpillars, believe it or not. It turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we took caterpillars out of the system, we're leaving a lot of energy locked up in plants, and you would have really depauperate ecosystems. Let's use the Carolina chickadee as an example. Got a lot of data on Carolina chickadees. They are at our feeders right now, or at least at my feeder here, all winter long eating seeds. And a lot of people think that's all they need. But when they're rearing their young, they are not seed eaters anymore. Most young birds cannot eat seeds. So the chickadees switch to insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. And it turns out they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. And I know that because of a project that my recent PhD student, Ashley Kennedy, completed. It was a citizen science project, and maybe some of you contributed to this. She asked people all over the country to take pictures of birds when they were delivering prey items to the nest. She got about 7,000 pictures, and what she did was construct the nestling diet for 20 of the common bird families in North America. And that's what you're looking at here. The green bars are the percentage of that nestling diet that was caterpillars. And in 16 of the 20 families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, if we took caterpillars out of the system, 16 out of the 20 common bird families in North America would not be able to reproduce effectively. So there's something special about caterpillars. Let's figure out what it is. Actually, there's a lot of things special about caterpillars. And one of them is that they are soft. They're relatively soft prey items. Think of this caterpillar as a small sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is cuticle. It's exoskeleton. It's undigestible. Birds don't want a lot of that. So it's perfect. This is thin wrapper around a very nutritious prey item, high in fat, high in protein. And because they're soft, the birds can stuff them down the throat of their babies without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear its young, they're pretty rough. They take that beak and it's like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, right now during migration, a lot of birds are actually chasing the fall aphids around. But do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? As I said, they're very nutritious, high in fat, high in protein. They have a low percentage of chitin compared to most other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. And they have a lot of sharp edges. And it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids during the bird breeding season. And I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate. And you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates, and vertebrates cannot make their own carotenoids. Carotenoids are only made by plants, yet carotenoids are essential parts of our diets. And that's why my wife Cindy says, I gotta eat my carrots to get my beta carotene, I've gotta eat my tomatoes to get my lycopene, my whatever that is to get my lutein, and she makes sure I eat all of those things because they stimulate my immune system. I cannot think of a better time to have a strong immune system. They're also antioxidants. They run around our body, protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about particularly male birds like this prothonotary warbler. He's bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. He makes pigments out of those luteins, puts them in his feathers, and the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids? They're getting them from, of course, the things that they eat, but carotenoid contents are not equally distributed across the invertebrate prey items that birds eat. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars, and they have far more carotenoids than other types of invertebrates, the most of anything that we've measured. The third bar is orthopteroids, so things like crickets and grasshoppers and katydids. They're pretty good as well. Here are the adult caterpillars, the moths and the butterflies themselves, far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. It's the caterpillars that eat the green leaves, but not the adults. And here's the earthworm way over here. The early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. Does the carotenoid content of prey items influence how birds are choosing their prey items? Well, Ashley did another study looking at bluebirds, in this case, Bluebird Diets. She had GoPro cameras and she put them on Bluebird boxes, and those cameras took a picture once every second. And she had a lot of GoPro cameras and a lot of Bluebird boxes, and she did it for 3 years, so she ended up with more than 1 million pictures that she had to go through. But out of that 1 million pictures, she found 7,628 where the pictures were good enough of the birds coming into the nest with the prey item that she could identify what it was. And she got this very nice relationship. The prey items taken the most frequently were caterpillars, and they had the highest carotenoid level. The ones taken next most frequently were those orthopteroids, and they had the next highest. And then everybody else is nestled down in here. So all this is to say that it's starting to look like caterpillars are not optional prey items for birds. It's looking like they're essential prey items for birds. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many caterpillars do they need? Is 1 or 2 enough? Well, let's go to chickadees again. A lot of data on chickadees, but there's data on many other birds as well. How many caterpillars does it take to make a clutch of chickadees? Well, 1 or 2 is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to make 1 clutch of a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. And if you want the chickadee to breed in your yard, you need that many caterpillars in your yard. Chickadees and most birds don't forage very far from the nest. With chickadees, it's about 50 meters. They are not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodline. And this thousands here is just to get to the birds, the nestlings, to the point where they fledge. After they fledge, the parents continue to feed them for another 24 days, but they're flying all around so nobody can count them. So you're talking about landscapes where we want these birds to breed that need to make a lot of caterpillars, or the birds aren't going to be able to successfully reproduce. Unfortunately, we design landscapes without that in mind. And most of our landscapes these days make very few caterpillars. So we have insect decline. We're measuring that all over the place. And it's starting to, we're starting to tie that to bird declines. If you go to the original data from the Rosenberg paper I mentioned that said there were 3 billion fewer birds, and look at which birds are actually declining, it turns out they're all not declining at the same rate. As a matter of fact, some actually are increasing, and that's the birds that do not require insects in their diet. So things like the finches and the doves that can reproduce on a milky substance they make from seeds. They don't need insects. But the birds that do need insects on average decline about 10 million individuals per species. So this doesn't prove cause and effect between insect declines and bird declines, but it certainly is suggestive. So I'm going to suggest that we need to start thinking about landscaping for caterpillars. Yeah, we want to make them pretty landscapes, but they also have to make caterpillars, or they're going to be dead landscapes. So how do we add caterpillars to landscapes? Well, you do that by adding the plants that make caterpillars, and that's really not that hard, but there is a catch, and that is most plants don't make a lot of caterpillars. So you have to add the right ones. If we look, so here's some data from your region, the Southwest. If we look at the number of plant genera, you've got 1,531 native plant genera in the Southwest. And if you look at the number of Lepidoptera species supported by each one of those genera, most of them, hundreds of those genera, support very, very few species of caterpillars. There's only a few genera. As a matter of fact, 38 genera that are making by far most of the caterpillars in a local ecosystem. So we've got to focus on those real powerhouses, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. The reason most plants don't make a lot of caterpillars is because caterpillars are really fussy about what they can eat. So you have to, and the monarch butterfly, of course, is a perfect example. It's not going to eat your crepe myrtles. It's not going to eat your boxwood. It's not going to eat any of the plants from South America. It's going to only eat milkweeds because it is a host plant specialist on milkweeds. Why? Why did it specialize in milkweeds? Why are most insect herbivores host plant specialists? Well, it's the plants themselves that have made insects that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And a lot of plants also have physical defenses that make them difficult to eat. And these are wonderful defenses that keep most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why most of the time, not during droughts, but most of the time, it's green out there. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. And if you don't believe me, after this talk, go outside and eat a plant. See if you like it. You're not going to like it because all those plant lineages are protecting themselves with nasty compounds. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat vegetables. They inherently know that they're toxic. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around the chemical defenses in most of these plants? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. Every plant lineage is protecting itself in different ways, and insects can't get around all those defenses, so they specialize on particular plant lineages, and they get good getting around those particular types of defenses. So monarchs, for example, are really good at getting around the defenses of milkweeds. They can detoxify cardiac glycosides. They can block the flow of the sticky latex sap that most other insects can't do. That's a specialization that allows them to eat milkweeds without dying. But for all those adaptations to fall into place, you need a long evolutionary exposure to each one of those plant lineages. These specialized adaptations do not happen overnight. Point is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to rebuild life in a particular place, we have to use the plants that are going to support that life. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well this works when you do it properly. I'm going to start with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. We have 10 acres of a farm that was broken up not too long ago. It had been farmed to death since the late 1600s. So we got about 300 years of farming here. Most of the topsoil's in the gully over here. And the last thing they did before we moved in was to mow this area for hay. But the farm was so heavily invaded with Asian plants, multiflora rose and Oriental bittersweet and all that stuff, that when they mowed it for hay, they're really mowing the rootstocks of these Asian introduced plants and calling it hay. So when we actually moved in, this is what most of the property looked like. That's my wife, Cindy. She's getting ready to remove all of these invasive species, Oriental bittersweet, Japanese honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, Callery pear, and on and on and on. This is what the 10 acres look like. So if you get discouraged, if you've got a serious invasive species problem and you think you just can't do it, think of Cindy. She did it. She did. Now, she didn't do it overnight, and she still is you know, she's got to maintain things. Things are coming in all the time. But it is possible. What was I doing while she was working hard? I was telling her she was doing an excellent job. And I also was putting some plants back. And I started with the plants that I knew would attract caterpillars that I wanted to take pictures of. It became a little game. And one of the first things I started with was trying to attract the Canadian owlet. This is the Canadian owlet. That's what the adult looks like a leaf. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have meadow rue, because that is the only plant that they develop on. And we didn't have any meadow rue. There was no meadow rue around us. The entire area had been farmed for 300 years. So I'm sure there used to be meadow rue, but none anywhere that I know of. So I got some seeds from someplace, planted meadow rue. It grew really well, but I thought it would be years before the Canadian owlet would actually find those plants. So I did not go out and check them. Well, after about a month and a half, I did go out and check them, and they were almost defoliated by the Canadian owlet. They found them right away. So I was impressed. And what I'd done, now we've got a lot of meadow rue and a lot of Canadian owlet. I've added 2 species to our depauperate landscape. Did it again with the goldenrod stowaway. That's a beautiful yellow moth that has nothing to do with goldenrod. That's a misnomer. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, called ditch daisy. I did know where some ditch daisy was, about 15 miles away in a power line cut. I got some seeds, planted ditch daisy, and it took the goldenrod stowaway a year to find it, but it did find it, and now we've got a lot of both. So now we've added 4 species. I wanted the Hackberry Emperor because it is a butterfly that should be on our property. But its name tells you what it eats. It's a hackberry specialist, and we didn't have any hackberry, so I planted hackberry. And that was it was a big success. Took a little bit longer, took about 3-4 years for the butterflies to discover our hackberries, but they're here in force now. I looked at one of the branches of one of my hackberry trees this June. I was just walking by it, and there were 9 Hackberry Emperor butterfly larvae, caterpillars, on that single branch. So big success. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, and so did the things that eat goldenrod. And in this area, that's 110 species of caterpillars, by the way. Things like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arsidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, goldenrod gall moth. Now, this is what I'm waiting for. This is the goldenrod flower moth and its beautiful larvae. For some reason, they have not found our property yet. So each year it's anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. One of these days, I'm going to go out and find the goldenrod flower moth on our property, and that'll be a great day. So on and on we go. I added Virginia creeper because I wanted to attract the Pandora Sphinx because I wanted to take that picture. That took about a year, but and that's what its adult looks like. A lot of other things I learned eat Virginia creeper. So things like the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx all came as well, and many other species. Wanted the zebra swallowtail because it's the prettiest of our swallowtails. Now this would be the northern limit of it on the East Coast. It eats pawpaw. We added pawpaw. The nearest population that I knew about was 26 miles south of us. I didn't know if they'd ever get up this far. Well, it took them 9 years, so we had to wait for this one. We had to be patient. And in the meantime, we got the pawpaw sphinx. I didn't know there was a pawpaw sphinx, and of course, lots of pawpaws. Wanted the double-toothed prominent because it's a very cool caterpillar. It looks like a dinosaur, but it eats elm, so I added American elm. Wanted the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful, so I added evening primrose, and it spends the day sitting in the flowers. Very cute. And we added lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plants that we have put into our property. I focus on oaks because it's such an important plant. But a lot of people think that you need a giant oak like this. This is the Bedford Oak in Bedford, New York. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old, but it's enormous. You don't need a giant oak like this before it starts to contribute to your landscape. As a matter of fact, it starts to contribute right away. And I know that because I planted my oaks as acorns and a few as 2-foot bare root whips. And right away, they started to attract moths like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the 2-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths, just moths, not butterflies, haven't gotten to them yet, have come to our property because of the oaks that are on there. And they come right away. Here's a pin oak that's just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a crocus geometer standing on the floor there, eating that oak right away. So you don't have to wait hundreds of years. They're productive almost immediately. Here's a picture of our property from the same perspective I took the first picture. We do have a little lawn here. We're very traditional. I just want to convince you we put the plants back, and with each plant lineage we got a lot of moth species. And I was so impressed with the moths that were colonizing our property that I made it a goal to take a picture of every one I found and see how many species there were. And I've been at it for 4 years. I'm still at it. Every time I go out, I get new species, but I'm up to 1,012 species of moths. Again, not butterflies, just moths that have come to our property. That's 1,012 species of bird food. That is 39% of all the moth species in all of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is 2.4 acres. Our lot is 10 acres. So on 1/240,000th of the land area of Pennsylvania, we've got almost 40% of the moth species. That's how successfully that works. And because we have so much bird food, we've recorded 59 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. It works, folks. You know, last week, this headline was out, you probably saw it. World Wildlife Fund says 2/3 of the Earth's wildlife has vanished since 1970. All I can say to that is, not at our house. Not at our house. This is reversible. You put the right plants back. We've increased the biodiversity at our house by at least 2/3, probably a lot more than that. So don't give up. These are terrible statistics, but we can reverse it with the right plants. But I know what you're thinking. What if you live in suburbia? You know, we've got 10 acres and maybe you don't. Will it work in a typical suburban lot? Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri, working our way west here. They have 0.6 acres, just a little bit over a half an acre. And they live in a typical development. Everybody around them has the big lawn and that's what they have. Well, the first thing Margie and Dan did when they moved in was to get rid of the invasive species that dominated their yard. And in Kirkwood, Missouri, that is always bush honeysuckle. It's everywhere. And then they planted a bunch of native plants and they put in a water feature that they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that were using their yard. They're up to 149 species that regularly use their yard. And that includes 35 warbler species. That is almost all the warbler species in the entire country. Just as a comparison, on their 0.6 acres, they got 35 warbler species. We have 10 acres. We've only recorded 8 species so far at our house. So they're doing really well, and the size of the property does not restrict what they're seeing. What about in an urban yard? Let's go to Pam Carlson's yard in Chicago. She has 1/10 of an acre. She lives, in Chicago, right next to one of the runways of the O'Hare Airport, right next to Kennedy Expressway. There is no connectivity between her yard and any type of a natural area. And she only has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in the US. Well, she planted 60 species of native plants, put in a little water feature, and then she started counting her birds. She's up to 116 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. And there it is, sitting right next to something in her yard. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house. That's an oak leaf right there. There's a clue of why these animals are in her yard. What about people who live in a city? 82% of us are now in city centers. Are they going to be out of luck? Well, in 2014, I was looking at this plant. This, of course, is Asclepias tuberosa. People call it butterfly weed, but that reminds me, we have a terrible marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds and then wonder why people don't plant them. So we're not going to call this butterfly weed anymore. We're going to call it Monarch's Delight. So I was looking at Monarch's Delight in 2014, and the first thing I saw were 2 species of megachilid bee, leafcutter bees. I know they're megachilid bees because they carry their pollen on their tummy, not on their hind legs. Well, leafcutter bees have very specific requirements, or they can't be there. They need pollen, they need nectar, but they also need soft leaves from plants like redbud, because they cut the edges out of those leaves and roll them up into a tube and stuff that with pollen, and that's where they lay their egg. That's where they reproduce. And they stuff that tube into a crack or a crevice. Well, next to Monarch's Delight, there was a redbud. So that explains why there were megachilid bees there. And that redbud, of course, blooms early in the spring and provides the forage that bumblebee queens need. Bumblebee queens have to start the colony all by themselves. They have to do all the foraging. There are no workers yet, and they need a lot of convenient early season forage to get that colony going. So they had it, and there were bumblebees there. And then I saw a monarch. As a matter of fact, I saw 2 monarchs, and they were there on Monarch's Delight. There also was another species of milkweed. Well, this was really good news to me because I had gone all of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. You remember 2013 was the low point in the monarch population. Only 3.6% of them left. And of course, I'm on the East Coast here. It takes monarchs a long time to get up the East Coast as far north as we are. And it was June. So here's 2 monarchs early in June, and that was most unusual. I was really impressed. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan. If you don't know what the High Line is, it's a top tourist destination in Lower Manhattan at this point. It was an old elevated railroad that had been abandoned. Somebody went up there and looked around, and there were all kinds of native plants growing up there that nobody had planted. They planted themselves. So they got some fancy designers, and this is the strip of nature that we're talking about. It's about 3 feet wide. And now, people in Manhattan are so starved for nature, they go here all the time. Literally millions of people each year. There's the Monarch's Delight. This is Rick Dark. He convinced me to go to the High Line to see all these wonderful plants. I'm not much of a city boy, and I dragged my feet, but finally he got me there, and I thought I'd see a bunch of plants and nothing else, because I couldn't imagine anything would go into a middle. This is 30 feet above the road with cars and taxis and everything else. It's not where I thought I'd see anything. But I was wrong. So it convinced me that thoughtful native plantings, and this is not 100% native, but there are enough natives there. If they can bring life back to the middle of Manhattan, we can do this anywhere. It's a very encouraging message. But if we're going to succeed, there's 4 things we need to think about. And the first one, nationwide. Now I know, East Texas, yeah, but you get to San Antonio, your lawns aren't so big, but nationwide, we have more than 40 million acres of lawn. That's the size of New England. That looks like this. This is a deadscape. Of course, it's a status symbol. We humans are not going to give up our status symbols. It says that this person has resources and that they're following all the rules and making sure their lawn is cut. So it's an advertisement of what a good citizen you are. But I'm proposing that we cut this area in half. The lawn you maintain is still going to be manicured. You're still going to be a good citizen. Everybody will still respect you, but you're going to plant the other half with those powerful native plants. And if we replant half of the area in the U.S. that is now in lawn, that'll give us 20 million acres to work with. How big is 20 million? And if we do this at home, we can call it Homegrown National Park. Well, 20 million acres is bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. And if we create a park, a nature-rich park right at home, there's a lot of immediate benefits that we're going to be able to enjoy. First of all, we can develop, maybe for the first time, or maybe redevelop a personal relationship with the natural world. There is no way we're going to be good stewards of the earth if we don't even know what the earth is comprised of, if we don't appreciate what we need to support ourselves. We need to be good stewards, so we got to have a close relationship with the natural world. Well, if it's at your house, you can develop that relationship at your own time, at your own pace. You can do it without facing the crowds that we now have in our national parks. It's free. It's never closed, no matter how many pandemics come down the road. No travel hassles, just walk out your door. And you get to experience the natural world alone. I don't know how you're going to develop this personal relationship in a crowded place. You need to do it alone, particularly our kids. No parental, what do you call it? No parents. Let them go out and experience the world by themselves. Richard Louv is worried about our kids' supervision. That's the word I'm looking for, parental supervision. Richard Louv is worried about our kids suffering from nature deficit disorder. And he's worried about it because they are. So he says, we got to get him back into nature. Okay, well, we're doing the best we can. We put them on a bus, 30 kids on a bus with a teacher. They go to a natural area, they walk around for an hour, then they come back. Teacher tells them not to touch anything when they're walking around. Well, that's better than nothing, I guess. But what they've really experienced is 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. What they need is the ability to go out alone and develop that relationship. And maybe they can hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii, and her patch of nature is pretty tiny, about 10 feet by 10 feet, lawn and a hedge. But she has still developed a relationship with lizards. This is how you hunt lizards, by the way. You get on the ground and you disguise yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. You gotta be serious. You can wear your best dress, but you crawl very slowly, trying to sneak up on those lizards. The lizards are anoles. They really are there, and this is something that she's had a great deal of fun doing. She's getting a little older now. She still does it a little bit, and I doubt if she's going to hunt lizards through the rest of her life. But I guarantee she's going to remember hunting lizards in Hawaii when she was small. If you want to do more than hunt lizards at home, get this book, Nature Play at Home by Nancy Stranisty. It's loaded with great advice for how to expose kids to the natural world in small local places. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn, and then the plants we're going to put in the side that of the half of the lawn that we take out of grass. Some of them have to be what I call keystone plants. One of the most important things we've learned in my lab in recent years is that not all native plants are contributing to food webs equally. Remember, without food webs, you don't have anything else, so that's critically important. Turns out that just 5% of our native plants, and this is true everywhere in the country, just 5% are creating about 75% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. 14% of our native plants are making about 90% of the caterpillar food. That means the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives at supporting life? On average, they are, but I can build an all-native landscape, 100% native landscape that supports very little life, because some plants, native or not, are really, really well protected and nothing can use them. So the question really is, do we want ecologically productive plants, the ones that are willing to share their energy in our yards, or benign plants, or even worse, ecologically destructive plants, the ones that become serious invasive species, escape and ruin our natural areas? I get an email once or twice a year from somebody saying, don't I know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago. That makes them native. That means that person can plant them and everything will be great. Well, remember, this is not our metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not. It's whether they're doing anything. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They support 0 species of caterpillars. So if you're trying to support a local food web, if you want your birds to be able to breed there, ginkgo's not going to do it. It's just not going to do it. What is going to do it? Well, in 84% of the counties of North America, and that includes most of the counties of Texas, oaks are number 1. Where I live, they support 557 species of caterpillars, 557 species of bird food, 900 species nationwide. There is no other plant genus that supports that much life. What is the power of keystone oaks in my yard? Well, remember, I've taken a picture of 1,012 moth species so far. And out of that 1,012 species, 888 have known host plants. So there's more than 100 species that I've caught, but I don't know what they eat. Of the 888 species, 262 species use oaks as a host plant. We have 59 genera of native woody plants on our property, and only one of them is the genus Quercus, the oaks. And we have hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So what does that mean? It means oaks represent less than 2% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity, but they're supporting almost 30% of our moth species. So what would happen if I took oaks out of my landscape? That's the power of a keystone plant. The diversity would crash, the bird diversity would crash. It would be serious if we lost our oaks. How do you find out what the keystone species are for your area? You go to Native Plant Finder in the National Wildlife Federation website, and you put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the plants ranked in terms of their ability to support caterpillars and thus food webs will pop up for your county, both woody plants and herbaceous plants. And this is what a typical list looks like for your area in Texas. Oaks number one or number two. Prunus very high, salix very high, poplars very high. It's really cottonwoods where you are, native maples, elms. I stopped because I ran out of room. There's plenty of other powerhouses. And these are the herbaceous plants, goldenrods, asters, helianthus, wild tobacco, wild strawberry. These three here are top pollinator plants as well. Not only are they supporting the most caterpillars, they're supporting the most native bee specialists. So, we want to support our native bees, but we've got to plant for the specialists if we're going to do that. If we only plant for the generalists, only the generalists will be able to use it. If you plant for the specialists, the generalists and the specialists will be able to use those plants. Notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows. You can go to the nursery and find a non-native oak. You can get the English oak, you can get the Chinese oak. Most of the time you're going to find non-native cherries, the Asian cherries. If you get a willow, it's probably going to be weeping willow from the Middle East. Lots of species of non-native maples for sale. But when you do that, even though these are native genera, if you bring in a non-native member of that genus, you're reducing caterpillar use by 68%. We did that experiment. So stick with the natives. Stick with the natives. If your nursery doesn't carry them, ask for it. Don't buy anything else. Ask for them to carry a native species, and they'll get the message eventually. They'll do it. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to plant keystone plants in our yard, and that will attract lots of insects, particularly moths, and then we'll kill them at our security light. Unfortunately, that is what we're doing. It's turning out that light pollution around the world, but particularly in the temperate zone, is one of the major causes of insect declines. Why? I mean, why does that happen? For 100 years, we have been wondering why moths go to lights, and we still don't know, but they do. And they fly around and around and around until they get exhausted. They die of exhaustion. They bang into the light and kill themselves. They get incinerated. They die of dehydration. The bats come and pick them off. There's a lot of nocturnal insects that get blinded by bright lights. Who knew? And it messes up the daily activities that help them reproduce. So again, the research is showing that this is a major cause of global insect decline. And to me, this is good news because it's the easiest thing to reverse. Just turn your lights out. I know what you're going to say. You can't turn your lights out because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your security light. So it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to find out is the bad man doesn't come very often. If you don't want to do that, take the white light out of your security light, particularly the mercury vapor bulb, and replace it with a yellow bulb. Yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to insects than our white wavelengths, and yellow LED lights are the least attractive. If we replaced our night lights with yellow LED lights overnight, we could not only save a whole bunch of energy, but we could save billions of insects. It's not hard to do. The fourth thing we need to do is landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What am I talking about? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the oak tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, it then spins a cocoon and hangs from a branch, then the adult emerges and they do it all over again. But most species, 94% of them, 480 of those 511 species, don't complete their development on the plant. They drop from the plant after they're through growing and wiggle their way below the soil and form a pupa, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter under the tree. And you know where I'm going here with this. We don't have any leaf litter under our trees, and we mow and compact our soil to the point where it's so hard that our caterpillars can't get underground. This becomes an ecological trap. So let's say these are these are keystone plants. They're attracting lots of adult moths. They lay their eggs. The caterpillars develop. They drop down. They die. Then the next generation is smaller, and not long you don't have any insects at all. I am convinced this is a major, completely understudied cause of insect declines. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option for caterpillars. I'm not trying to discourage the use of trees in cities. I am trying to discourage the profligate use of cement as a default landscape. I mean, this is just laziness, and it ruins our watersheds as well. This is what most people do. They have a big lawn and they put a tree in the middle of it. Nobody studied what the caterpillar survivorship is in a situation like this, but I can guarantee it is better in a situation like this, where you have a tree, you have a layered landscape, there's a native azalea and ferns and ground cover. And I know in Texas you're gonna have different plants, but the principle works. Maybe you can have a dogwood here. The caterpillar drops out of the tree. This is not compacted soil. It's not going to be mowed. It's not going to be trampled, and it can complete its development without any problem. This is where, if you have the option, you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. Again, a safe site. This is how you shrink the lawn, by the way. You build beds around your trees. Beds that aren't going to be mowed, they're not going to be trampled on, and they become safe sites. You can put in various ground covers like wild ginger and native pachysandra, mayapples, foam flowers, lots of things. Again, safe sites for our caterpillars. Another piece of good news comes from research that another one of my PhD students recently completed. That's Desiree Narango. And that is, there's room for compromise in our plant choices. She looked at chickadee reproduction in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., inside the Beltway of Washington. And these are typical suburban yards, typical urban suburban yards. I mean, they're not big. And what she did was find yards that were dominated by native plants. None of them had all native plants, and yards that were dominated by non-native plants, and many of them had all non-native plants. And she compared chickadee population dynamics within those types of yards. And the first thing she found is that the yards dominated by introduced plants, are Asian ornamentals for the most part, produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you reduce the amount of bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Even though Desiree had a nest box up in each one of these yards, the chickadees would come, they'd look around, and they'd say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try. If they did try, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. They were almost 30% more likely to fail, which meant they never reached maturity. If they did reach maturity, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and maturation was delayed by 1.5 days. You might say, well, those aren't huge differences. But if you put all that together in a population growth model, this is what you get as a function of the percentage of non-native plant biomass in the landscape, from no non-native plants to 100% of the plants in your landscape being non-native. The dotted line is replacement rate. This is the rate at which the population has to reproduce in order to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at this rate, it's a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you reproduce over here, make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population. If you make fewer, you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. Right here is the place where those lines intersect, right around 30% non-native plants. So as soon as you exceed 30% non-native plant biomass in your yard, you're down in this zone over here, where you've got an unsustainable population, and you're just, each year it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So this is good news to me for two reasons. First of all, this is the first time this has been measured for any bird anywhere. So if anybody who doubts that your plant choices do impact other things that we really would like to have in our yards, go to this study and check it out. But this is the area that's exciting to me. This is the area of compromise. Look, you can have up to 30% of your plant biomass, non-native ornamentals. Make your lawn or your yard really beautiful with these guys. As long as you don't exceed 30%, then you can still have a sustainable breeding bird population. And this is good news, because if my message was you can't have any non-natives, I'd have a very small audience. Because we love our ornamentals. You can have your ginkgo, you can have your crepe myrtles, just don't let it dominate your landscape. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. Somebody sent me this picture in an email this spring, and I actually lost track of the email. I have no idea who it was, but it's the land manager of this formal garden. And what he's doing is sneaking in native plants. His goal is to replace all these plants with native plants, just to show you can have a formal garden that's all native. Here he's got Joe Pye in here. I'm not going to call it Joe Pye weed because it's not a weed. You know, formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden in a traditional suburban setting like this without upsetting anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. Then all of a sudden it's okay. It's formalized. Look at all the species that are here. If everybody did this, our native bee population would be much, much happier, and it would be living where we need them. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere. Remember, these bees are pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. You don't just need pollinators where there's agriculture. You need them every place you need plants, which is every place. How about this? This is, this is 2 or 3 times the size of that little one. These are Drew Latham designs, by the way. Imagine the life that is here versus the life that is here. A lot, none. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can. And you've got a good example right there in San Antonio. Minnesota has a cost-sharing plan that encourages homeowners to replace part or all of their lawn with appropriate native plantings. The state helps them do that. That's great. Florida, parts of Florida are paying people to have burrowing owls in their front yard. Burrowing owls, it's a listed species. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you got paid for being a good steward of an endangered species on your property, everybody would want one, rather than trying to get rid of them because you'd have to face restrictions. Missouri. I think this program has ended, but they used to have a bounty on calorie pear, highly invasive plant. If you brought in a calorie pear body, you got a free tree replacement. And of course, your San Antonio water system, Public Utility gives $100 coupons to plant native plants that are water savvy. Look at those crepe myrtles, got to get rid of those. And encouraging people to make their yard more water friendly. And there's lawn replacement programs in the far west as well, particularly California. You get up to $2 per square foot rebate if you replace your water thirsty lawn with appropriate xeric plantings. Okay, I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one is that we've assumed nature is important but not essential, which means when push comes to shove, nature gets shoved. We like it, but we just don't believe that we absolutely need it. We're coming up on an election, as you well know, and soon somebody's going to publish the top 10 things that people are worried about, and biodiversity is not going to be on that list. Or if it is, it'll be the first time. We just don't seem to worry much about that. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-sized poster that I think reflects our entire society's, our entire culture's view towards conservation. We do want to save wildlife so that our future generations can enjoy it. I hear that from the top conservation biologists. But to me, that suggests nature's there just for our entertainment. And it's far more than that. We need to preserve nature so that we have future generations. Much more urgent. Number 2, we've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, I alluded to this earlier, but if we restrict our conservation efforts just to the untouched areas of the world, we're condemning them to failure because there's not enough of those areas. That means we're only going to conserve functional ecosystems on little patches that, again, are too small and too isolated from each other. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and ecosystems. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That is 71 rug fragments, none of which are functioning as a Persian rug. And this is exactly what we've done to our ecosystems. And we built no man land in between each one of the habitat fragments that we have left. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that terminology because it suggests to me that there are places on the planet that have no ecological significance. There's certainly places where we've destroyed the ecological significance, but every square inch of the planet ought to be ecologically productive. It all has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes everywhere. So what we have to do is put the plants back. We got to glue our rug together, glue our ecosystems together with those keystone plants and a lot of other diversity, not just creating biological corridors that allow plants and animals to move back and forth, but make these areas rich enough so that life can actually exist in those no man's land. They're not going to be no man land again. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, few ecologists, few conservation biologists. We did not see it as an inherent responsibility of every single human being. And I have no idea why. It ought to be the first thing you're taught in kindergarten, because every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of the Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of good Earth stewardship? I have no idea. Stan Rushworth, Cherokee elder, once said the Western settler mindset, it's not just the settler, I'd say the Western mindset is I have rights. The mindset of many indigenous groups is I have obligations. Okay, we have rights, that's great, but we also have obligations. We're not born with these mindsets, we're taught them. We've got to focus on this one a little bit more. We all have obligations to keeping the Earth a livable place. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity where you live or for a living, although it is a good living, but you can save it where you live. And I like this approach because it empowers each one of us. You know, right now, so many of us feel absolutely powerless with the enormity of the Earth's problems. You just feel like there's not anything one person can do. But in this case, there is. Plant one of those powerhouse plants. You can measure its impact the very next day. Put in a pollinator garden, shrink your lawn, do those, get rid of the invasive species. You will see the difference, and it's just you that did it. Single person. You are now an important contributor to the future of conservation. It also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You will get depressed if you do that. Just worry about your little piece of the Earth. If you own property, again, shrink the lawn, get rid of your invasive species, put in pollinator plants, use those keystone plants. And if everybody on private property does that, we'll be more than 75% done. If you don't own property, you can volunteer, either help somebody who's got a big piece of property or work in a park or preserve. Everybody's underfunded. Everybody loves those volunteers. So as property owners or volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and ultimately our own fate. Now, I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Doug. That was very inspirational, I must say. We got some questions for you. One person asked, is there a way to measure the native biomass in your yard or landscape versus non-native? Like you're trying to get to 30% as you described.
Right.
How would you do that?
Yeah, there's a number of ways. But the best thing is just estimate it. So it's not counting the number of plants. If you have one giant oak tree, it's only one plant, but there's a lot of green biomass on there. So you can do it by volume. You're looking at the volume of leaves. There are formal ways to do it. You measure the diameter at breast height and lots of ways, but you don't have to get that formal. Just estimate, look at the plants on your property. Are most of the greenery they present native or non-native? If you can get the most, then you're talking about something more than 50%. That's well on your way. But when we have done this, we have counted the percentage of non-native plants in local neighborhoods in Northeast Maryland, Southeast Pennsylvania, and Delaware. It's 92% non-native. So it's easy to see we got a long way to go in that regard. But
yeah, Steve Manns had a really good question that he points out that most of the people that are on this webinar are pretty much on board with this, but it's the people that are not open-minded to life and human survival and only think about how they're going to keep their yards fresh and clean and tidy. To have systematic change, how do we do that? I mean, how can we get more people on board? And obviously this is a difficult, complex question, but you're the man, so take a shot at it.
Yeah. Well, of course, that's been my goal for the last 15 years. You're talking about changing culture, and changing culture is hard. But I can tell you that at least in the last 10 years, I do see a difference. It is changing. Look at, we're having this webinar tonight. We had one in Florida the other day. There were 1,700 people on it.
Wow.
There are people interested in this all over. And 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. So I do see change. If you look at native plant sales, both in specialty nurseries and typical nurseries, in many places of the country, maybe not everywhere, but in many places, they're through the roof. They look like the human population growth, straight up. And that's become a problem because people want to plant these plants and they can't find them because they're not growing enough. These are all measures of the fact that this is indeed catching on. People have noticed, and the monarch has been a major contributor to that. All of a sudden, 3.6% left. We don't want to lose the monarch. You know why we want to save the monarch? Because it's pretty and it's got a fantastic migration. It's interesting. What we need to do is get equally excited about saving all the other things that maybe aren't so pretty, but critical in terms of running those food webs. And when people realize that, they do get into it. So, what do we do? I mean, well, you can write books. I think we're going to reach a threshold where it becomes common enough that even the people who are totally tuned out, and that's a lot of people, will start to think about their yard and the land that they control. They'll think about changing so that they can be just like their neighbor. That's what dictates what people do more than anything else. Studies have shown it is fitting in with your neighbor that is the most important thing. So as more and more neighbors do it, more and more people will want to be like their neighbors.
I thought that one of the really interesting points in your book that I kind of was aware of, but didn't really grasp until you spelled it out, was the history of lawns and the history of how lawns are perceived as a status symbol. And it's just appalling to think about what we do with lawns and how we waste so much water and fertilizers and all of that. And so that gets me to another question that's come up repeatedly that you do go into a little bit in your book, but what can we do with HOAs? How to approach HOAs? I know you go into it a little bit, but maybe you could just quickly summarize for people here that, you're in a community and the whole community's bought into the certain set of landscaping appropriateness. How do we address that? Do you have some recommendations? And I know that our water utility saws, they get involved in this every now and then where they have to kind of navigate with someone and help them approach an HOA. And we've been involved at the Texas Butterfly Ranch a little bit as well.
Right. Yeah, it's a serious issue. Let's talk about why we even have HOAs. It's to avoid this. It's to set rules that will essentially establish the status level of your community. People don't want their property values to go down. If you got the rusty car in the front yard, it says, well, you're not being a great citizen. So we're going to make rules. No rusty cars. All of a sudden, the rules extend to how much lawn you have and how well you cut it. And in other words, it's to continue the perception that everybody in this neighborhood is a high quality citizen. That's why we have HOA. So what can we do about it? There's a number of things. First of all, most of those rules were established in the 70s when we weren't thinking about we weren't thinking about living with nature. We weren't thinking about having functional ecosystems where we live. Nature was someplace else. Humans and nature couldn't coexist. So it was all about aesthetics. Well, now we know better. But a lot of people haven't learned that yet. So I would suggest infiltrate your HOA. It is people that is running this, and they're enforcing rules that people made up, which means people can change those rules. So infiltrate, educate, give them my book, do whatever it takes, but that's what's going to change those rules, is by changing from within. But when we landscape, we want to do it within cultural norms as much as possible. And we can do that using cues for care. So if everybody learns that native landscaping is not just, ugly and messy and something we have to put up with. It can actually be very beautiful and productive at the same time. They won't, you won't get the pushback that we normally get now. So be a good example is what I'm trying to say. What do I mean by a cue for care? Well, beauty strips are one, and I'll just give you a few examples. Just that strip of grass. Here's, a big planting. It all used to be lawn, but now it's got this one strip of grass, and that shows that this is intentional. This area has not been just abandoned and come back like this. It's intentional, it's maintained, and that's what people want to know, that you're doing this on purpose and there's a reason for it. They can be fairly wide, but you've got, great big native planting back here. And that's what you can do to your yard. Or very simple, here's a rain garden along a swale, but it's formalized with this one strip of grass. That's called a beauty strip. And that one lawnmower width does wonders in terms of people's opinions.
Yeah.
So I will stop.
That's okay. We do have a question. So, just talking about invasives and non-natives, it is more palatable to gardeners, including myself. I'm not a purist about natives. I prefer natives, but for example, I have tropical milkweed in my yard. We're curious in San Antonio where you come down on tropical milkweed. That's always a very contentious issue here. For those unaware, tropical milkweed is the milkweed that is the most available milkweed, which is the host plant to monarch butterflies. And technically it's not native to San Antonio, but we're kind of on the border because it's native to northern Mexico, and with climate change creep, it's, I could argue that, it might as well be native here. And frankly, it's the only milkweed available. So where do you come down on tropical milkweed, Doug? Okay, well, I come down where the research comes down. It's true. You were down there next to Mexico. Asclepias corypsavica, that's the tropical milkweed. That is the milkweed that is down in Mexico where the monarchs go to spend the winter. So to them, it's not non-native at all. That's the first one they encounter. It's soft. When monarchs choose a milkweed, they're going for the softest leaves. So it's always something that they like. The problem with corypsavica, as you get higher up into the U.S., particularly along the Gulf Coast. I don't know if this is the case in San Antonio, but along the Gulf Coast, and it could be the amount of rain or whatever, there's a disease, a protozoan, and its initials are OE, that it infects monarchs and their wings get deformed and it essentially kills them. And the problem is when you grow corypsavica in an area where you don't get dieback from frost, so that it's perennially there, the spores from OE accumulate on the plant over time. And there are places, particularly in Louisiana, that's where most of these studies were done, where 90% of the corypsavica have OE spores on them, and the infection rate for monarchs that go there is around 90%. So what you're doing, again, that's an ecological trap. You're calling in the monarchs to kill them, and that's not what we're trying to do here. So there's some big question marks, though, because that is not the case with Asclepias corypsavica in Mexico. It doesn't have a lot of OE down there. Why not? I don't know. We need more research on this, and maybe you don't have a lot either. But one thing that will reduce the infection rate is to cut it back at least once a year, but probably 2 or 3 times a year, to make sure that you always have fresh foliage that's not loaded with those spores. That's the only problem that you might face. Yeah. So someone wants to know, what can we do about bamboo?
Well, if you already have it, you got a big problem. Bamboo there are a few native plants that are outlawed, but bamboo is one of them. And in a growing number of cities like Dover, Delaware, you have bamboo, you got to get rid of it. It'll grow right up through your driveway. In England, it grows right up through the floorboards in houses. So not tolerated. How do you get rid of it? Backhoe is one way. That's the problem. It forms these deep, solid roots that it is really difficult to kill. And once it starts spreading, it will go into your neighbor's yard and they will not be pleased with you. A fellow faculty member, his neighbor, planted bamboo I don't know, 30 years ago. His entire backyard now is a bamboo jungle. That house is unsaleable until he takes care of that. So certainly don't buy it.
So are you absolutely opposed to pesticides, insecticides in any form or use, or do you strategically use them?
I'm not. Yeah, kind of go in there. This is where people get up and leave my talks, but you know, when we bought our place here, it was loaded with invasive plants, and we weren't going to use any herbicides. Well, that doesn't. There's no easy way to kill the root system without herbicides. And if you don't kill the root system, I don't care. You know, you can cut it back and everything. It comes right back the next year. And I decided pretty early on, I'm not going to live long enough. You know, it takes. You can repeatedly cut it back. Once every 2 weeks, every time a little bit of green comes up, and for a couple of years, and you'll eventually exhaust the root system. But, you know, who's got that kind of time? So what we do, I don't spray, I paint. And Cindy won't use any of this stuff, but I come around with a bucket, and she cuts it off at the base, and then I paint onto the surface, paint an herbicide. Preferably one that is designed to do that. Roundup is not designed to do that. Roundup is designed as a foliar spray, and it's taken in by green leaves. But painting, you can do it in January. You can do it below freezing. It's just a very convenient time to do it. And then it takes it in, if it's oil-based, and will kill the root system. So you're using very little material, which is, you know, that's what everybody's worried about. I'm too lazy, but I've got to do this. I want to take soil samples right next to something that I painted and see how much material actually gets out. I suspect it's very little, because often I got to paint more than once. I'm not even killing the plant I'm trying to kill. But I consider it like chemotherapy. You know, it's undesirable. We don't want to do this, but having the invasives take over the world is I think it's worse. So
Trade-off, for sure. Yeah.
That's my opinion. So.
Okay. Well, I'm with you. Surgical use is sometimes inevitable, because you're right. We have all kinds of crazy invasive situations, and you can pull and weed and, you know, grub and do all of that. But sometimes you do have to reach for that stuff, unfortunately. Here's a question from Adelia Harrison. For those of us who live in urban apartments, can you recommend natives that will grow in containers on our balconies? And can an apartment balcony be ecologically productive?
Yeah, a lot of natives will grow in your containers. The problem is I'm not great on your Texas ones. You could take that list of 100 plants, and I bet you a lot of them would do. I know that the Joe Pye we have around here, which gets tall, does really well in a container. Milkweed does really well in a container. I think a lot of blooming plants do. Any of the eupatoriums do well in containers. And that makes it convenient, particularly things if you're working with the monarch, because monarchs get around. They will find it. So if you're just starting out, start with milkweed. And I almost guarantee that the monarchs will find it and reproduce on it. But get a big container. One stalk is not good enough. If there's a single larva on there, it's got to be able to complete its development. And if it's the only milkweed around, the female monarch will circle around, and she'll end up laying a bunch of eggs on it. And then you don't have enough food. So make sure, get a couple of containers, make sure you have enough milkweed so that they can complete their development. But it's also a very good source of pollen and nectar for our native bees that is movable, and you can diversify. You know, many of the prairie plants will do well in containers. Some of them have very deep roots, so you want to get deep containers as much as you can. But yeah, I'm all for it.
A question from Sarah Christus. How can we introduce a cost share program to encourage using property for native plants to our own local governments and state governments?
Well, we have to convince the people we elect that this is an important issue to us. Our government officials do what they think will get them reelected. It's that simple. You can manipulate them totally if you get them the message, we're not going to elect you unless you do what we want. We're not very good about that. We think they are, you know, they're dictating policy to us we're in control of them. We're the ones that elect them. I don't know how it came about in Minnesota, but that would be a place to start and say, how did they get it going? We could solve so many of our problems on the national level if we changed our tax structure. If we taxed huge lawns and gave people tax breaks for having other types of landscapes, that would turn it around overnight. Even if it wasn't a huge tax benefit, it would give it cultural, you'd have cultural permission to do these things. Your neighbor couldn't bother you anymore and say, hey, I'm getting a tax break. You know, it would work. It's already worked in Costa Rica. That has been shown. It works really well in other countries. So we could do that here. How do you get there? We just have to tell the people we elect that this is an important issue to us.
Have you suggested that tax break idea to the Biden and Trump campaigns?
I'm expecting a call as soon as I get off here.
So we have a couple questions on your previous comments about herbicides. People want to know, what do you recommend they use? You said Roundup's not the one to use for painting on. What is a good paint on herbicide?
I use a product called Garland. I think it's called Garland 4.
Okay.
Because it's oil based. You can buy it on the web. You know, you're supposed to have pesticide training to do this. These are toxic compounds, so you're supposed to use gloves and equipment. And I'm not supposed to be recommending this stuff to you, but that's what works. So
okay, got it. So, you know, you make such an incredible case for caterpillars, which, you know, when I read your book, my takeaway was it's all about the caterpillars, which, you know, we're all about anyway at the Texas Butterfly Ranch. But there are people and there are situations where caterpillars can be threatening to a crop or a plant. Is there some way to know, like, okay, this is too much, we need to do something like feed it to the chickens, or, you know, do something? Blanca Timsakovich wants to know, how do we balance plant survival with caterpillars multiplying in a landscape?
Well, in a balanced landscape, by balanced, I mean balanced trophic levels, where you have the plants and you've got the caterpillars, but you also have the natural enemies of those caterpillars. And if you're talking about a native system, it's almost impossible not to have the natural enemies. Caterpillars have a lot of enemies, and most of them are other insects. They're parasitoids, tiny little wasps. Each species of caterpillar has many species of parasitoids that will sting them, lay eggs inside of them. I try to, in order to get pictures of adults, I try to rear these caterpillars through. And at the end of the season, it's almost impossible because they're all parasitized. So there's a lot of pressure down that way. You've got those birds eating thousands of them in the spring. And a lot of people say, I look for these caterpillars in my yard, I can't find them. That's right, the bird has already eaten them, and you only find one or two here and there. So having too many native caterpillars typically is not the issue. It's we don't have enough. Now, I am not talking about introduced caterpillars. I'm not talking about the gypsy moth or any of the invasive insects that we have, because they're a problem because they come over here without those natural enemies. There's almost nothing that attacks them, and they easily get out of bounds and cause huge problems. I'm not talking about agricultural pests where we plant 500 acres of exactly the food that they need and then wonder why they outbreak. And it's also a single species of plant. So it's not a diverse ecosystem that supports a lot of these natural enemies. And it's very easy for even native insects to get out of whack in an agricultural system. But in a balanced ecosystem where you have a diversity of plants, you're going to have a diversity of caterpillars and a diversity of natural enemies. It's typically not something, that you have to worry about. There are a few exceptions. I don't know if San Antonio has them or not, but we have something called fall webworm and something called tent caterpillars. They're both native species. They both make a tent, and the caterpillars live within it, and it keeps those parasitoids out. They're hairy. A lot of birds don't like hairy caterpillars. So they've got several things going for them, and they're called an eruptive species. So some years they're really common, and they can locally defoliate a branch or sometimes an entire tree. The other thing we don't appreciate is how much damage trees actually can take before it's a problem. Healthy trees can be defoliated, 2, 3, 4. I had a black cherry in my yard that was defoliated 9 years in a row by tent caterpillars. The next month it was out fine, and it seeded itself in next to my back porch, and now I actually have to take it down. It's way too big. So the tent caterpillars never did slow it down. They can take a lot more damage than we think, but you know, it's unsightly, and I get it that some people don't like them.
Yeah. We're just going to take a couple more questions here, and if we didn't get to your question, can't talk. If we don't get to your question, we'll try to answer it later through email or chat. The one question is that I don't know where to go. Oh, Talacha is interested in buying some land and doing so, doing what you did with your property. Do you have any recommendations for, you know, ascertaining the best criteria for choosing land to have the greatest impact?
Well, I can be selfish about that and say buy the land that's the most disturbed and then fix it. The easiest thing is to buy a piece of property that's pristine and you don't have to do anything and then preserve it. That's great. But we need to restore as much land as possible. So I think, you know, help me out, Monica, but I would say an abandoned agricultural setting would be a great place to start because that needs to be restored.
That's a good point. Honestly, I hadn't thought about it like that, but if you want to have the highest impact, then go and find the worst piece of property you can find. There's a really great case study here in I believe they're in Blanco, but the Bamberger Ranch here in Texas. It's an example of a really large property that someone, David Bamberger and his family, took on, and they completely restored it. They took all the cedar off.
Yeah, I have heard of that.
There. I mean, this is an amazing story of environmental conservation success that's been lauded and awarded over and over. But, you know, not everybody has the, you know, the means to do that. But, you know, start small and do what you can. The vacant lot, you know, your own front patch, whatever you can do.
Yep.
One other question here, is high strength vinegar or salt better or worse in the environment than using commercial herbicide to get rid of invasive and non-invasive? And I'm very interested in that because I've been using a lot of vinegar lately, and I have to do it repeatedly.
I don't know the answer to that, and I'll bet, well, those things won't be very persistent. Salt, of course, will kill lots of things. It'll kill lots of plants. You know, when you get salt intrusion from a big storm, for example, it wipes out a lot of things. So the nice thing about salt or vinegar is that it's not going to persist in the environment for years or decades like DDT or something else would. So it breaks down much more quickly. But in high concentrations, these are toxic things. If you're comparing that to an herbicide that also breaks down quickly, which one's worse? I don't know. You don't want anything that's water soluble and going to get into the water table. Salt certainly is. I can't imagine using that much vinegar that would be a problem. But I doubt if this type of research has been done. Yeah. It's probably it may be less harmful to you personally, the applicator.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Right. Well, here's a good question from Jan Hans. In our neighborhood, we have discussions about the spraying of mosquitoes. Are there any studies that show the effect of monthly spraying of mosquitoes?
Yes, there's a number of studies. We're really talking about, I'll just call them Mosquito Joe. It's the entire mosquito spraying industry that really took off when Zika virus was a big thing, and a few people came to Florida who actually had Zika virus, and everybody, you know, they started spraying New York City to control Zika virus. There wasn't any Zika virus in there. We just went crazy. We got to kill all the mosquitoes. So it spawned this great big industry. And there's misinformation about it. Mosquito Joe will tell you, well, this is a natural compound, and therefore it's harmless. It is a natural compound. It's pyrethroids. They're from, you can get pyrethroids from chrysanthemums, but cyanide is a natural product too. It doesn't mean it's harmless. He also says it's only going to kill mosquitoes. That's not even close to true. It kills every insect that it comes in contact with. The frustrating thing to me about mosquito spraying is it doesn't work. You're trying to control mosquitoes in the adult stage is almost impossible. You have to kill 90% of the adults to do that. Mosquito spraying, fogging, it shows it kills about 10% of the adults. So we're not even close to succeeding there. It's also very expensive. The way to control mosquitoes, which we've known for decades is in the larval stage. You hit them where they breed, and in a human-dominated landscape, that's going to be typically human-created containers. Our sewer system, our gutters, tires, any place that has temporary water, that's where mosquitoes do really, really well, because they lay their eggs, the larvae develop before predators can get in there. Mosquito larvae are they are the food that drives aquatic ecosystems. Almost everything in a pond or a lake eats mosquito larvae, including all the fish. So it's not permanent bodies of water that produce mosquitoes. It's temporary bodies of water that are too small or too ephemeral to support predators. That's where we should exert our control. So there's a product called the Mosquito Dunk. It's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a bacterium that kills aquatic diptera. The recommendation is you get a bucket and you fill it with water and you put in straw or hay and let it ferment for a couple days. That becomes irresistible to mosquitoes that want to lay their eggs, gravid mosquitoes. So they lay their eggs in that bucket. The eggs hatch, you put in a mosquito dunk, which you can get at the hardware store, and the larvae go up and they eat the mosquito dunk and it kills them. And you have a very targeted control right there in your bucket. If everybody did that, you'd have far fewer mosquitoes. It's very cheap, but it's not dramatic like the big spray that everybody thinks, well, you're doing a wonderful thing here. What you don't want to do is be throwing mosquito dunks into established wetland situations, because it also kills chironomids, midges, which do not bite, but they're an important component of aquatic ecosystems. So you want to be responsible about it. But your little bucket is contained, and it's just a far better solution than mosquito spraying.
All right, we're going to take two more questions. The first one is, do you have a school program that school gardens could follow?
No, but people have asked me about it for,
What's your next book, Doug?
But you know what? National Wildlife Federation has an entire curriculum for this type of thing that they have people working on that, developing it. So that would be a good place to start.
Yeah. All right, and final question. Describe your photography technique. Robert Casanova is very impressed with your photos. So what are you doing there, Doug? What's the trick? You're not using your iPhone, are you?
No, I'm not. No. It's easy with digital these days to take good pictures. You just delete the bad ones, and then all you have is good ones left. But all the cameras are good. So I have a Nikon. People say, what kind of camera do you have? I have a Nikon, but Canons are, they're just as good, believe me. And all the brands are good. It's the lens that makes the difference. So I have a telephoto lens. I've got a couple telephoto lenses for bird shots, where you have I've got a 600 millimeter lens where you can't be closer than 18 feet, that's good working distance. And then I have a close-up lens that I do the caterpillars with. Caterpillars are easy to take pictures of because they just sit there. Birds are hard to take pictures of because it's often low light and they're moving like crazy. And so
the caterpillars are posing for their glamour shot.
They are. Think about the same things you would for composing any picture. Think about the background. If you put it on your hand, you're going to see a picture of your hand with an insect on it. I always try to go for a natural picture. So try to come up with a natural background. Things like that. Think about what you want the product to look like, and then angle it instead of straight on. There's a lot of little tricks that make it look good.
Okay. Well, I really want to thank you for joining us today. Everybody, this is the book. Oops, can you see it?
It disappeared.
There you go. Like doing a green screen thing. Nature's Best Hope. It's a great read. And a lot of the questions that you're asking in the back of the book, there's a whole section of Q&A. So I just wanted to thank Doug for being here. All of you, thank you for joining us. And please come to the rest of our festival. This is the first of many events that we have. Every Thursday we have a special event that we're hosting, and there's probably about 16 or 18 events now up on the website at texasbutterflyranch.com. So check it out. Everything's free, and we look forward to seeing you there. And please tell your friends and join us. Doug, thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome. Good night.
Good night, everyone.